Look at you looking pretty as a picture.
Oh, honestly, this is like very HD, and I don't know how I feel about it. I'm on a limited amount of time because I've got to. I'm go 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 today.
I'm
Um.
understanding the warning. I'm just gonna behave.
Oh, you understand the warning.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, welcome to our podcast. I'm Rosie, and this is Catherine, and this is 26 to Life. Because after 26 years together, we have been friends for longer than a life sentence. And so now we just tell each other true crime stories because it's what we love, it's what we want to do, and if we can make this a full-time job, amazing, perfect dreams. So
Go
here
follow
we
us on
are.
everything, and trigger warning for everything. As always, only listen if you're feeling strong enough. Rosie did a whole introduction because she is go 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 today, and I'm going to sit here and be good as gold.
Woo! Yes. I mean, I worry because this is going to be a long one, but I also don't have that much time. So this is going to be, snappy. We are going to have some back and forth because I feel like there's going to be a lot to say about it. But, yeah,
From
we'll
me,
keep up the pace.
not
We'll
unless you
keep
ask
up the
for my
pace.
input.
No, please. I still need your input, otherwise I'm just talking to myself. Um, okay, let's start with Andre Nielsen. He was born on the 15th of September 1944 in the northwest of England. Don't ask me where the northwest of England is because I already know that you won't know. So, northwest, northwest. Um, his mother became pregnant after having an affair with a married Canadian soldier, and so he really didn't know about his father at all. His dad did send money for the first year of his life, but otherwise he was fully supported by his mother, who was a nightclub hostess. He didn't have a smooth life in any way, shape, or form. His mother died in 1955 when he was just 10 years old. He then went to boarding school where he was eventually expelled for truancy, and then he was then were living with his grandmother where he was eventually treated for depression. His stepfather, who he also didn't have much to do with, suffered from alcoholism and killed himself in 1958. In 1969, his grandmother, who was literally his lifeline at this point, was found unconscious in a gas-filled room by herself, after also trying to kill herself. She survived, but she never fully recovered, and she didn't speak coherently ever again. So in 1982, after suffering with depression for most of his life, Andre committed suicide in his bedsit after desecrating his mother's grave.
Thank you guys. Well done. The
I told you I was
speediest
quick!
case we've ever done. And that is the story of Andre in the northwest of England. Have a lovely, lovely weekend, everyone.
See you next week!
See you next week, guys. Thank you.
I
I
knew
was
that you
so
were going to
good.
do
You
that.
have no idea how many things I was going to say to you.
What did you possibly have to say?
Andre Nielsen, was he related to Dennis Nielsen? Firstly. Secondly, northwest of the country, is that Liverpool?
Yeah.
See, learning. Third thing I was going to say is, why do we care about his stepfather? How are they still linked? Like, did he adopt him? Did he stay with him?
This is all going to come out. So this
Okay.
is all happening. So,
But you asked. I didn't say it. I sat
okay,
here.
no, I'm glad. This bit, it's good for me to just be able to go through it because that's not the whole point of the story. This is just a secondary story to the main story. So the main story is about his mother. If you remember, I said that she died when he was quite young, when he was about 10 years old in 1955.
She was a nightclub hostess.
Yes, exactly. He and his mother were very bonded. Obviously, he had no father, and if his mother died when he was 10 years old, he actually described himself as not having a fully formed personality when his mother died because he was 10. He still had so much growing to do. He didn't know who he was as a person. So you can imagine the toll that this had on him. But more than that was who his mother was. So his mother was called Ruth Ellis, who on June 21st, in 1955 was the last woman to ever be hanged in Britain.
Ooh.
And I know, that's it right there.
Question.
Right? And Andre was never known as himself, as Andre or Andy, ever again. He was forever known as Ruth Ellis's son. So you can imagine a 10-year-old boy just growing up as Ruth Ellis's son, this woman that had been hung for the crimes that she committed. You can imagine that that's not going to have a positive impact on your life. Go.
Don't you think it's interesting how when you say the last woman ever to be hung, that means the last woman in this country ever to be executed, like receive the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
But in other countries, they just changed how they
Kill people.
Because we never had anything like the lethal injection, did we?
I don't think so. No, no, we
Electric
didn't.
chair?
No, no.
So
It's
we just went
barbaric.
from like hangings
Mm.
to being dumb.
Well, they did originally. It was public hangings, so they did make a step from public hangings to then it not having any audience, and so then it was all in private, and then they stopped it completely. So there was some kind of a progression
But we
for
went
it
from
being.
executions as well.
Oh gosh, yeah. Whew. So let's talk about Ruth Ellis and why her death is so famous. At face value, her case was described as open and shut. But as you dig deeper, it became one of the more controversial cases, if not one of the most controversial cases that Britain had ever seen, and it paved the way to change the law and eventually bring an end to the death penalty. So, when we talk about the crime that she committed, we're not debating whether or not she did it because we know that she did it. But there's a lot of other nuances around it. There's lots of other circumstances that we should be considering, and whether or not the death penalty was the correct sentencing for her,
What do you
whether
think
it was
about the
deserved.
death penalty?
I think it's I think when it's very clear cut. So David McGreevy, the last case that I did, and he murdered 3 children in cold blood. That was it. Like there was no reasoning for him to killing 3 children. There's never any reasoning for killing 3 children, and he did admit it as well. He confessed to it. There was absolutely no evidence to say that it was anybody else. Like you knew 100% that it was him. He killed 3 babies. I think that he would have deserved it. But there are other cases, so such as what we'll go through with Ruth Ellis, is there are so many other factors to consider that perhaps hanging wasn't the most justified sentencing to her crime and her situation. So I feel like there are certain cases when I'd be like, yes, 100%, but there are others when probably not so much. But I think that
But because
the
of things
problem
like
is,
forced confessions and
yeah.
wrongful convictions, you just
Mhm.
can't have the death penalty.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that like so many times, and I'm sure we'll cover some of them in the future, when people are convicted of crimes of murder, put on death row in the States, obviously we wouldn't cover those ones, but put on death row, and then all of a sudden something new comes out. They come up with a new DNA testing and realise that it wasn't them at all the whole time. So I don't know. It is hard. So I understand. I would 100% be okay with people that you know for 100% certainty, but then also who is
No, I
going to be
agree.
that
But
person
that's
to
what I'm saying.
who's going to be who's going to be the person to decide with
Me
that
and you.
100% certainty. Fine by me.
I think that should be a new law that we pass. It has to go
Yeah.
through our scrutiny first.
And guaranteed, David McGreevy would not have been released under my watch.
Never. Not in a million years.
Not in a million years. So that would be rule number 1, get him back in prison, take off his head.
Yeah. But I feel like that about all paedophiles.
Fine by me. Sex offenders list, get rid of it, just kill them all.
Do you know, I've been listening to a podcast in America
I can't talk about this.
and they're getting 1 year for having CSAM in it, child sexual exploitation material.
1
Child
year.
abuse material. 1 year.
What, on the register? Or in prison?
In
Or
prison.
both? That is not enough.
Anyway, come on, quick, chop, chop. Don't get distracted.
Okay. So, a quote from the Daily Mail reporting on the crime. 6 revolver shots shattered the Easter Sunday calm of Hampstead, and a beautiful platinum blonde stood with her back to the wall. In her hand was a revolver.
I'm being a platinum.
Now, I hear that sentence, and it just immediately sounds like Hollywood, doesn't it? It feels like they've sensationalized the whole thing already. This beautiful platinum blonde. It doesn't say her name. It doesn't say about the person who was killed or shot at or anything. It's
Good old
I don't know,
Daily Mail.
Oh yeah, amen. So Ruth Ellis was the platinum blonde in question. She was very Marilyn Monroe. You know, this was the 50s. This was when Marilyn Monroe was, you know, coming into her own. So it was the short curly hair, the thin eyebrows. It was very Marilyn Monroe-esque. So she was arrested at the scene. Ruth Ellis, this is not Marilyn Monroe, obviously. She was arrested at the scene, handed over the murder weapon, and almost immediately confessed to the crime. So basically, what happened was that there was somebody else there, and she said, I think you should call the police now. And then the police came, she handed them the weapon and said, yeah, I did it. So the story that was told at the time was one of a jealous woman who shot her boyfriend when he had tried to break up with her. And that was the general story that was told during the trial too. But there was so much more to it. Her legal counsel did not advocate for her in the way that they should have done, that you would have expected her legal counsel to advocate for her. The jury didn't get the full story, and Ruth didn't help herself much either. Of course, if you were sat in the jury and told a story of how a woman packed a gun into her handbag, drove directly to the pub where her boyfriend was drinking, and shot at him 6 times, you'd probably say guilty as well, would you not? Of course. That's without question. She's guilty. What? Go on, tell me.
Nothing. I'm just saying, would I though?
Well, I mean, if that was the story, that was
I'd be like, mistrial. What did he do?
If that was the story, she packed her bag, had a gun, left the house, killed him.
Premeditated murder.
Yeah,
Murder.
You would have said guilty if that was a story that was told. And she confessed to it at the scene, handed in the gun, said yeah, it was me that did it. I mean, there's not really that much that you can argue. But
have you done jury service?
No, have you?
No, I can't wait till we have to do jury service. I hope we do it together.
That's not as if we both just did at the same time. That is so bad. Okay, but what if I told you that she had been sexually abused by her father since she was 11 years old? What if I told you that the man that she had murdered had punched her so hard in the stomach that it caused her to suffer a miscarriage? What if I told you that it was another so-called lover of hers was the one that supplied the gun, drove her to the pub, and essentially goaded her into shooting him? Like I said, there is so much more to it. And although none of that takes away from the fact that she did, in fact, murder her boyfriend, it's all things that need to be considered when you're deciding whether or not someone deserves the death penalty. Does it not? So let me tell you the whole story.
But she did still murder him.
She did still murder him. Yeah, no, 100%. So let me tell you about Ruth Ellis. So she was born on the 9th of October in 1926, originally in Wales, but she moved to London with her family when she was young. Her father, Arthur, was a musician and travelled playing in cinemas. When Ruth was
cool.
I know, right?
So like he would play while the film played?
I think so. That's how I understand it, yeah. So when Ruth was 2 years old, her dad's identical twin was killed in an accident, and it was soon after that he obviously just had a bit of a breakdown. He started drinking and he started sexually abusing her older sister, Muriel. And as a result, Muriel gave birth to a child at the age of 14 who was raised as one of their siblings.
You don't get to say, oh, my brother died and I'm so sad.
No, 100% no. I think that a lot of the articles that I read just pointed at that as to the like point when everything changed. Yeah, exactly. And that's when there was a downward spiral for him. And
disgusting, man.
And obviously Ruth was only 2 years old, so she wouldn't remember anything even before that. But poor Muriel, this child was then raised as one of their siblings. When Ruth turned 11, she too was sexually assaulted by her dad. And although their mother knew what was happening, she never stopped it. She never did anything to interfere. Muriel, however, would often send Ruth out of the house when she knew that her dad was going to cause trouble, and they would both try and fight back on a regular basis. In 1944, Ruth met the Canadian officer and gave birth to Andre, and so by 18, Ruth was a single mother, modelling and posing for soft porn, living in London. When Andre was 7 years old...
I'm confused.
Go on.
You said that she was sexually assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
Then you didn't tell me that bit.
What?
So, originally you said, would it change it if she'd been sexually assaulted by her father? But then you went on to say that Muriel was sexually assaulted and would send her out the house.
Yeah, no, I said when Ruth was 11, she too was sexually assaulted by her dad.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why I missed that.
Just glazed over. You just don't even listen to me anymore. Cool.
I'm sorry, did you say something?
I hate you so much. So when Andre was 7 years old, Ruth was briefly married to a dental surgeon called George Ellis, hence her last name, who was a violent alcoholic. They had a baby called Georgina together, and she spent a lot of time with Ruth's mother, but she ultimately went to live with her father
Stepfather. This is the
when
stepfather.
Ruth and George separated. But yes, that is the stepfather.
Are
So
any men nice?
no, I don't think so.
Okay.
So obviously, this is where I said that Andre wasn't very close to his stepfather, George, but it's still a figure in your life, you know? They were still together. He was still in his life for a little while, and to know the fact that your stepfather the father of your sister has gone to alcoholism and killed himself, that will
And
also have a toll on
it
you.
changes. I do think it's different because you're you have a sibling with that person. Not
Yeah,
with that person,
exactly.
but like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. 100%. Like I'm not close to my sister's dad, but if something were to happen to him, I would feel it, you know? I would still be incredibly sad. It would still affect me. So Ruth soon began working as a nightclub hostess in London. Although she was from a working class background, she took lessons,
Elocution lessons.
and she spoke in a fake accent to try and hide her background. And it was at one of these nightclubs that Ruth met 25-year-old David Blakely. David Blakely was quite posh, to put it lightly. He was a racing car driver, and considering that
I
only
thought you were going to say he was a racist. Like, posh and racist just
Posh.
go hand in hand.
I mean, at that time, probably. He was a racing car driver. Only 15% of people in that time owned a car, which, I mean, let alone
Racing car drivers are rich sport. You have to start with all of the.
I mean, but the fact that even in those days, only 15% of people had a car, and the fact that he not only had a car but he had a racing car, like, come on, he was doing well. And that's compared to 78% of households having a car in 2022. So, yeah, but that 78% of households have a car, but 81% of people have access to a car. So, I mean, considering in London not everyone has a car because transportation links, whatever, but I mean, 15%, imagine, that's not that many people. That's one in
God, the traffic would be
6,
so delightful.
maybe. Yeah, the lack of. David was described as a bit of a playboy. He wasn't really reliable, and he was a bit of a fickle character. They were both. I know, tell me about it. They were both apparently having affairs with other people. In fact, I believe that David was actually engaged to another woman throughout his relationship with Ruth. What pig. However, they became quite serious quite quickly, and Ruth was pretty much head over heels for him. And soon enough, David also became abusive and violent towards Ruth.
Oh my God, why is there so many of them?
Doesn't have much luck with men. But then also, there's that people say that when you've had an abusive upbringing, when you're in a nice, calm, and healthy relationship, it almost doesn't feel natural. You feel uncomfortable. You seek out the same kind of.
Yeah, it's something to do with like the dopamine. You don't.
Yeah.
You need that spike in craziness.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, just why is there so many people who are willing to be violent in relationships?
I know, I hate it. I hate. So, at the races, for example, Ruth would make champagne lunches for David and his friends, but once he took her to a race, he lost and he blamed her, so he took it out on her and beat her up.
See, where is that logic?
Genuinely, like
how thick as shit do you have to be?
Unless she was running onto the track with like.
Unless she was riding the fucking horse. What has she got to do with this?
Okay, it was a car. He was racing the car.
Oh, why did I think he was watching a race? A horse race.
Because I just said
he was racing. And he lost.
And he blamed her. Yeah.
Oh, that's pathetic.
I know, I hate
You're
him.
just a sucky race car driver.
In the photos, you're drawn to her blonde hair and beautiful face, like I said, very Marilyn Monroe. But if you look closely at some of these pictures, you can actually see bruises on her arms. It's It's so sad because you look at these pictures and you really do think she's beautiful. She's smiling. She's so stylish. And then you look closely and you can see that she's deep down that she's having a terrible time. So sometime in March 1955, like I'd said before, Ruth suffered a miscarriage after David punched her aggressively in the stomach. Her friends and other people who saw her often, people like at the nightclub and stuff that she worked at, would often told how she would usually be covered in bruises. There's even a recording of her speaking with friends about how David once gave her a black eye. Just casually.
When was rule of thumb?
I don't know, that was probably around the same time. So, I'll come to it in a bit, but at this period of time, domestic violence wasn't a thing. You know, you were still allowed to legally rape your wife at this time. It wasn't raping your wife wasn't even a thing that people considered.
No, of course not.
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
So no one really did anything about this, but I feel like rule of thumb is probably around. I mean, it's probably still in action right now in this dumb story. What? Tell me it was like 1990s or something like that. Stupid.
Sorry. Basically, there's a whole load of things. Some people say it's a myth. However, there's something from the House of Lords that says it's not. In 1782, the English judge Sir Francis Buller was ridiculed for saying it. There's no evidence. It's actually maybe not true.
Interesting.
I know. If it was true, you'd just chop off their thumbs, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much.
When you go to court about it. No, but sir, I'm allowed to beat her. As long as it's no wider than my thumb. Mate,
So
what thumbs?
Where's your thumb?
Where's your thumb?
Good one, mate. But yeah, no, she was just so casually would talk about how David gave her a black eye and that he would just beat her up. And she just casually brought this up to people as if it was like a normal thing.
Maybe it's because there was so much of it around. Like,
yeah.
A lot of her friends probably experienced similar things as well.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that being the case. So there's also a man named Desmond Cusson. He was a good friend of Ruth's, whom she and Andre had been living with. He was one of her lovers. He wanted to marry Ruth. He was wealthy. He even paid for Andre to go to boarding school, and he took her in whenever they needed help. And
was he a good egg?
A good egg-ish. I mean, from what we know, he seemed like at the time he loved her. He loved her. He would do anything for her and Andre. When all of this stuff was happening, he provided an 11-page statement to say that to testify towards their relationship and how Ruth would often stay out and come back limping, had bruises all over her body, her face, everything like that. So, but the thing is that Desmond wanted to marry Ruth and he would have done anything to protect her. So she could have gotten out and lived a happy life with him, you know, like, it's just that she was so infatuated with David that, yeah, okay, so Desmond was her lover, but he was never an option, you know, for her. It was always David. So on Easter weekend in 1955, when David didn't come home and wouldn't answer her calls, apparently he'd broken up with her, but those are neither here nor there. But Ruth put her son to bed at 8 p.m. and left the house with a gun in her bag. So she took a taxi to the Magdala pub in Hampstead and she fired 6 shots, 4 of which hit her target. One of them, the first one she missed. The second one, she hit him. He fell to the ground. She shot him another 3 times. And then the last one, apparently the bullet ricocheted off something and hit someone in the hand.
Can I just stop you there for a second, right?
Go on.
If you had said to me she did this in reaction to him punching her so hard in the stomach she lost a baby, I'd be like, fair.
So this is what all comes into the trial, not necessarily the trial, but all of the outrage afterwards. So this is all of the sentencing and, yeah, I guess it is
because it's like, oh, she's doing it because he's not answering her calls. I'm like,
yeah,
skew with priorities here.
Yeah, no, it's definitely there's definitely stuff to consider, but I'll talk about how everyone talks about this in a bit. So she was arrested, she admitted to the murder, etc., etc., etc. Her confession to murder is only 3 pages long, which they described as very short. So at the time, you'd expect them to be, even now, you'd expect them to be incredibly long. Details of timings, how long were you waiting, have you ever fired a gun before? Like all of these things that would add up not only to the murder, but will kind of set the scene and why you did it.
Yeah, but that surely comes from the questioning of the police.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If
No,
you said
guaranteed.
to me, "Tell me these," like what happened then, I'd be like, "I got out of my car, I shot him, and I got back in the car and I drove away."
Yeah, they didn't press for anything. They didn't pry. They didn't ask any questions that would get them any more information. They
Yeah,
pretty much
open
just saw
questions.
they were thought to be very classist. So they saw that David was of an upper class, and she was of a working class, and so they thought this
Snobs.
this woman has killed her rich boyfriend because he wanted to break up with her, and now let's just get her in prison. So they didn't really think anything of it after that. They didn't really do a proper investigation at all. So she said that she'd got a gun from a member at the club 3 years prior, but she doesn't remember his name. She said she accepted it out of curiosity. What kind of man is in a club with a gun and says to the nightclub hostess,
The person
"Here,
who's trying to get rid of a gun.
do you want this?"
The person who's trying to get rid of a gun. Guaranteed, because the only time you do that is if you're like, "Oh, no one's ever going to link me to having given a gun to this random person, and I need to get rid of this gun."
So true.
You
So
could just
true.
walk up to a random person. Here.
But they also didn't look into that. They didn't look into they didn't check whether or not this was true. They didn't try and find the person that provided her the gun. They didn't
Yeah, but how you
trace.
could go back 3 years, no CCTV, and be
No,
like,
but all guns have serial codes on them, serial numbers.
not if it's filed off.
Well, it wasn't filed off. There was still a serial number because someone like 5 years ago traced it back to see where the gun had actually come from.
And
So
where had it come from?
I will tell you in a
Oh,
minute.
okay.
So they definitely could have done that, but they did not. In Ruth Ellis's file from Holloway Prison, where she was held, the prison doctor wrote a note to say that she had a large bruise on her thigh. That was from, she's quoted said, from David knocking her about. She says that once David had hit her in the ear so hard that she went temporarily deaf. And he also mentioned the miscarriage that had occurred 2 to 4 weeks before the shooting. But neither of these were mentioned in Ruth's statement. The police didn't do any further investigations into this or anything else like that. When the
Hold
police...
on, that's also the even if that had all come to light, and I'm not saying it's right, but even if all that had come to light, they still wouldn't have said that was a good enough defence, because when you make the argument for self-defence, doesn't it have to be like imminent self-defence?
Oh yeah, and we'll come to that, please.
Whoa!
When the police had finished their investigation, the chief inspector summed it up with the fact that they are of completely different stations of life. David's family are highly respected, and he represented a leg up because Ruth's parents were poor, and basically said that she would go to any lengths to keep him. It was coldly premeditated, and he basically just damned her. Anyone who would read his statement would have thought, yeah, killed him in cold blood. She wanted it. She did it for the money.
And who was that from?
That was from the chief inspector. But the thing is, if it were just about the money, then she could have left and been with Desmond, because Desmond loved her. Desmond wanted to marry her, and he was rich, exactly, and he was like a semi-decent guy. So,
other than you did kind of say that he goaded her into killing herself.
Well, yeah, I didn't realise you were going to remember that. So, this statement showed the class prejudice that was apparent in the 1950s, and not only that, even if they had, like we had spoken about, known and decided to take into account the domestic violence, it was treated as a private affair. There wasn't any charges for domestic violence, and it was, like I said, still legal to rape your wife in 1955. And it was only do you know when the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act came about?
1990 something?
1976. So
no, the raping your wife is way more recent.
Oh, yeah, no, but the domestic violence and matrimonial proceedings. And what was the first piece of legislation dedicated to combating...
1991.
Yeah. But this
When
was the first... Let me say my thing! This was the first piece of legislation dedicated to combating domestic violence. You go.
Can you believe 4 years before we were born,
Yeah.
it was still, marital rape was not accepted as a thing.
I think that's absolutely
1991,
disgusting, isn't it?
in the case, a man was convicted of attempting to rape his wife, having challenged the decision, citing the marital rape exemption. You get an exemption.
I hate people. I hate people.
Awful, 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 awful.
So soon, the tabloids were reporting her as a femme fatale. The whole murder was sensationalized and things were fabricated to make it all seem so much more Hollywood. Like I said, the platinum blonde, she was written about to say that she was beautiful, ambitious, and that was pretty much all that anybody saw. That was it. They didn't mention the fact that she was, abused, that she had an awful upbringing.
I told you, they're obsessed with the dyeing the hair blonde.
It's so true. It's so true. But as a single young mother, despite all of this, many people did feel connected to her. They saw themselves in her. She was like a real person. And a Labour MP, Sydney Silverman, she was a campaigner for the abolition of the death sentence, encapsulated this sentiment when, it was a he, sorry, Sydney, when he wrote in the Star, "She seems to most people a normal human, all too human, being weak, foolish, and hypersensitive," which is probably where the controversy began. When people started posting things like that, postings, if we like now, people started printing stuff like that, it did start to get people talking a little bit. So during the investigation, Ruth tells the police the same story about how she got the gun from someone at the club. She couldn't remember the name, and they didn't look into any further. But like I said, 60 years later, so that was about 10 years ago, a documentary maker looked up the serial number of the gun because it was available, and they found that it was imported into Cape Town for the use of the British military. Which, guess who worked in the British military in Cape Town?
Desmond.
Desmond! Yes, he did. Coincidence? I don't think so. What are the chances that there's someone who was stationed in Cape Town at the same time that these guns were imported there for the use of the British military?
To kill her boyfriend because he was jealous.
So Ruth also said that she got a taxi to the pub where she shot David, and again, they didn't look into whether or not this was true, which taxi she got, who drove her there. However, at the time, black taxis were overseen by the Secretary of State, and it was the Assistant Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis that were able to grant cab and cab driver licenses. So
they could have looked into it.
No, not only could they have looked into it, but if a cab driver they knew that they were the ones to drive someone to the killing of someone, no, please stop saying things. They think that they would have spoken up because they would have wanted to help the investigation, because they would have said, "Oh my God, that was me, I didn't realise," and they would have wanted to be a part of the investigation so as not to get their licence taken away.
Was it quite well documented and widespread in the country at the time?
What?
So what I'm saying is, you're saying a cab driver would have spoken up. Was it very much front page news and da-da-da-da-da?
Oh, yeah, no, it would be. But not only that, it was all in London anyway, so they would have heard about it. If you're a cab driver in Hampstead, you would have heard about the fact that she got a cab to kill her boyfriend, right?
You'd be like,
Yeah, exactly. There would be word on the street. So if a taxi driver had picked up the lady who had shot her boyfriend, for sure they would have been in contact with the police to assist and to help the investigation in any way so as to protect their licence so they could carry on being a cab driver. But it later transpired that Desmond also owned a black taxi.
What is this man doing?
So
he's a soldier, he's a black cab driver, he's really rich. What are you doing?
He could have been the one to drive her to the pub.
He's like us. He's got 12 different jobs, except he's making loads of money off them.
Yeah, honestly. Stop. Oh my God. Tell me about it. So if he had provided the gun, if he had driven her to the scene of the crime and driven her away from the scene, well, not away because she was arrested there. But should he also be considered for conspiracy to murder?
Yeah.
I would think so as well.
If he'd just driven her and you didn't know why, no. But if you couldn't prove that he'd just driven his girlfriend to a pub, then no. But the fact that he supplied her with the gun, and also the fact that he was clearly very jealous of this man and would have done anything to get rid of him.
Oh yeah. And so, okay, what's more,
Please.
who's one person that you think in all of this would probably be able to provide some information?
Andre.
Yes! Wow.
I was going to say Andy. Did you call him Andy at some point?
Yeah, he used Andy as well. They didn't interview him once at all.
How old was he?
10.
Would you though?
Yeah, because she said I put my son to bed at 8 p.m. and then left the house. So he was the last person to see her leave the house.
Okay.
And
so when you say to a 10-year-old boy, 3 days ago.
Yeah.
What day is that? The Wednesday. The one after Tuesday. Yeah, Wednesday. What time did Mum leave the house? I don't know.
Okay, not even.
What did Mum do? If you ask a 10-year-old boy, what did you do today? The only thing they can remember is how long their poo was. Oh, and what they had for lunch.
Okay, say you had gone and murdered someone, and I said to your son, do you remember the last time that you saw your mum? And he said, he would have been able to say, yeah, she left the house with Arlo. Maybe he wouldn't be able to say the exact time, but he would be able to say, yeah, she was acting a little bit weird actually. She was crying and shouting and like manic cleaning.
To be like just a regular day in my house.
But he would have known something. But
I think,
okay,
she was acting strange.
You are arguing all of this, but I have more information that will just prove you wrong.
Okay.
If they had spoken to Andre, not only would they have confirmed that Desmond gave her the gun, he also would have been able to tell them that they actually had 2 guns and both Ruth and Desmond left the house at the same time with the guns. He saw Ruth and Desmond practice aiming in the living room, and also was there when they fired practice shots in a forest not far away. And I feel like you'd remember that as a 10-year-old if there was guns in the house.
You are correct.
What's even more is that there was a lady called Marie-Therese Harris, and she tutored Ruth French. And she said how she noticed that she was often covered in bruises, and one of the last times that she saw her, she looked like she was someone on the verge of a breakdown. And she went to the house. She was let in by Andre because nobody else was home, strangely. She spoke to him, and, you're just chatting with a 10-year-old, and she mentioned about how she was having troubles with pigeons where she lived. And he just casually opened the drawer and offered her one of the guns and said, oh, here.
Shoot the pigeons.
Yeah. And he was just handling this gun. It wasn't loaded. It didn't have any bullets in it, and he showed her that it wasn't loaded. But, like, why? Why? But there were 2 guns there, which also proved that there were 2 guns, one for Ruth, one for Desmond.
Desmond. What a slippery little character.
But none of this, so all of this about having the 2 guns and all of this information from Andre, this only came out after Andre took his own life. And he made a recording talking...
Like 10 years ago?
No, he killed himself in 1982.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were saying when the documentary came out and they learned all of this stuff.
Oh, yeah, no. So they learned about all of this stuff when he died, when he had this tape recording, and he did some other stuff as well, but I'll talk to you about that, like people that he spoke to. But this is when he spoke about it all, and that was when it all came out, and it was like, wow, okay, wow, nobody knew this 30 years ago. Cool. So the trial. With that, on the 20th of June in 1955, the trial began in the Old Bailey. Have you ever been to the Old Bailey to just watch the trials?
Have you?
Yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. Yes.
No way.
Yeah, it's quite cool actually. You can just sit. I was going to say fun, but fun isn't the right word. But you sit, yeah, you can sit in the gallery and you can watch all of the proceedings. You can watch the sentencings. You can watch the actual court cases. It's like it's really
That's going to
interesting
be my new hobby.
Oh yeah, I'll take you there for your birthday.
That'll be so fun.
Birthday dad.
Let's
So
go for yours though. It's a bit chilly to be travelling around on my birthday.
yeah, but you don't want to be sitting in the Old Bailey in July.
Oh, that's true.
Fucking sweltering. Okay, we'll just make a day
I'm
of it.
coming to do a
Don't worry.
cold dip in
Oh yeah,
July.
you're right. Not as cold, but sure. Yeah, cool, cool, cool.
God, I'm cold.
So the prosecution was led by barrister Christmas Humphreys. His name was Christmas.
No way, he's Chris.
His name was Mr. Christmas. Yeah. I thought this was a lie. When I was watching the documentary, I had to put the subtitles on to make sure that I was actually hearing his name correctly because
And it's spelt Christmas.
Christmas Humphreys. I then looked at all of the documents and articles and yeah,
We need a documentary on his parents.
Yeah.
Because they were definitely on something.
Yeah, probably. And in 1981, before Andre died, he actually found Barrister Christmas and asked him about his mother. And he said that Christmas Humphreys had described Ruth as cold-blooded. And he said that was entirely untrue. He actually said the whole recording of their conversation, he was like, "Do you remember my mother?" And he says, yes, of course I remember your mother. And he was like, "Do you remember what you said about my mother?" And he said, "What did I say?" And he said, "Well, you described her as cold-blooded and honestly, I think that is entirely untrue." And but Humphreys said that at the time he had no doubts. The jury had no doubts. Even her defense couldn't help. It was an open and shut case, and that she was thought to be a cold-blooded killer. Do you know where that comes from, cold-blooded killer?
Well, no, but I'm thinking if it's like cold-blooded, that's something to do with reptiles.
No.
And
So-
reptiles have cold blood.
Stop! No time.
And William Harvey found out about the circulation system by cutting into cold-blooded animals. Go. You tell me the real story.
It was all to do about in a duel. So if you killed someone during a duel in the heat of the moment, your blood was hot, so it wasn't thought to be murder. But if you went away from the duel and then you came back and killed him later, your blood was no longer warm and it was cold blood because your blood
You're
was
not
cold.
doing it in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. So it was a cold-blooded murderer. Interesting, huh?
Very interesting.
Also, a side note about Christmas Humphreys, when Andre committed suicide, Christmas Humphreys actually paid for his funeral. Oh. And because obviously he felt so guilty because he fucked up his life. And the judge presiding over Ruth's case, Sir Cecil Havers, it turns out that he'd actually sent money every year for Andy.
I'm so unbelievably confused.
Why?
Because it's like they wrongly convicted her.
No, they didn't. I think it was just the circumstance. So,
No, but that's how they're acting.
yeah, I know, but I think it was just the whole. It's not
The question is not necessarily. It's not about whether she's guilty. The question is whether or not you agree with the death penalty.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we go. So there was some confusion as to how Ruth was appointed her solicitor. His name was Mr. John Bickford, and he wasn't appointed by the court or requested by Ruth or her family, and he just kind of appears. He rolls up because apparently Ruth's housekeeper told him to visit, but is that believable? Because she wasn't close with the housekeeper.
Desmond's got her.
When they spoke to the housekeeper, she thought that Ruth was actually married and she didn't know anything about her personal life. So you're not close enough to recommend a solicitor, are you?
Desmond.
But no, it turns out he did a lot of work for the Sunday Mirror, a newspaper, which is the same paper that actually eventually bought and published Ruth's story. So conflict of interest? I think so.
He was a lawyer that worked for a newspaper.
Well, he did a lot of the cases that, yeah, the Sunday Mirror would then later. He got the inside scoop, you know. They basically smeared her name and used it as a lesson to all young girls as to what not to be. So there was a whole thing when they looked back on it. Did he have an ulterior motive to just try and get this inside scoop? Was he hired by the newspaper? It was suspicious, but it was never actually confirmed. But despite this, he did actually seem to build a strong case in Ruth's favour. He detailed all of the violence that Ruth was submitted to. despite it not being in any of the police investigation, he did his own investigations, and he said that he found out that twice he tried to strangle her. He'd wrote down in her words, yes, David tried to strangle Ruth. He wrote that she had said, I felt there was no alternative. Twice he tried to strangle me. He had 2 hands around my neck and squeezed until everything went black. He was saying, oh Lord, don't let me do it. So all of that's attempted murder. She suffered a miscarriage after David punched her in the stomach, as we know, and he gathered all of the statements from witnesses who spoke about the abuse and the bruises, including the French tutor and people at the nightclub, etc.
But this was or this wasn't presented at the case?
We're going.
Okay, you said it wasn't presented at the case, that's why I'm confused.
He was looking for a recommendation for mercy in a case of diminished responsibility so as to be spared from the death penalty. So they kind of knew that she was going to be convicted of murder, but they just wanted them to say, give her mercy for the whole circumstance surrounding it. But in the trial, so Bickford was her solicitor, but Stevenson was actually her lawyer, this other man called Stevenson. So Bickford didn't have as much to say. He prepared all of the notes, he prepared all of this investigation, he prepared his recommendations for the case. He handed all of the notes over to the barrister, Stevenson, and basically just had to watch it unfold and how he used those notes and whichever way he chose. So when the trial was ongoing and Stevenson was up there
doing his thing,
he didn't really speak much about Ruth's abuse at all. There was once that he actually questioned Cussum on the stand and Desmond, and he questioned him about her relationship with David, and he said, I don't want to push you for details, but how often did you see that kind of mark on her? Why don't you want to push for details? Surely you want Desmond, someone who loved Ruth, to be able to testify to how badly she was beaten by this man. Would you not?
Yeah.
Surely that is what he needed for this mercy conviction. Bickford wanted to garner sympathy for Ruth, but it seemed like Stevenson was doing the absolute bare minimum to try and do this. Stevenson was thought to not really know women, or to understand them.
Why do you need to understand women?
He once gave a man a lesser sentence for rape because he described it as anemic, which meant to him that the woman had suffered minor injuries. So it was
because it wasn't a violent
rape. He got a lesser crime.
Rape is violent.
Yeah, exactly. Rape is rape. Rape is always violent. But maybe he was just a product of his time. Like we said, legal to rape your wife. Domestic violence wasn't really a thing.
Okay, anyway. Then she's a product of her environment and murder isn't a thing.
So true. So he only cross-examined 2 out of the 16 witnesses that the prosecution brought up. And Bickford said himself he was absolutely stunned. Stevenson told him that he wasn't going to follow Bickford's brief, and he wasn't going to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses. So we knew that Bickford was expecting murder but hoping for a recommendation for mercy, but Stevenson was actually going for manslaughter with a partial defence of provocation. But surely it would have the same...
Yeah, but also you can't do manslaughter with provocation because it wasn't in that moment. I understand I believe it, but I thought you wanted my input too.
I do want your input, but if you would let me finish the sentence, which meant that the murderer had to have done something to excuse the murder, but that wasn't the case, and that only would have worked if it was done immediately after an episode of violence.
God, I'm so clever.
I actually hate you so much. In the days leading up to the murder, there was pretty much nothing that could have been seen as provocation. And if so, then why didn't he push for more details on this violence? So if he was trying to get provocation, you'd think that he wanted more details about how bruised she was, how often she was beaten, and things like that. And obviously the miscarriage that she suffered because he punched her so hard in the stomach, that was 2 to 4 weeks before. So it was just too long ago to be considered. Go on, Catherine.
So is there an actual rule about how many days prior to the murder there is before provocation? Or is it... Because I thought it was just a case of like, you're beating me up, self-defence, or
Yeah. See, but the thing is that I let things fester. So if somebody's pissed me off like last week, I would still be mad about it a week later, and would that be deemed as provocation? Because still be mad about it if you hold a
I
grudge.
I just think I get it. I get why they can't. I get his plea doesn't make as much sense as the diminished responsibility of
Yeah,
murder one. I think just have the death penalty taken off the table.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But it all comes back to that cold blood, doesn't it? So if she'd killed him in the heat of the moment, then she wouldn't have been considered a cold-blooded murderer. But it was the fact that she was at home, he hadn't done anything to her for the last couple of days. She packed a gun and went and shot him, you know? So it wasn't. I think it was what it came back to.
But then I also think the toll that things take on you. So I can't remember where I heard it, but it's apparently really common for women who have a an abortion to find out that they're pregnant roughly about a year later because it's dwelling on them even though they maybe didn't
Yeah.
realize. They will prepare themselves to have another baby because
Mhm.
it's such a, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not that I'm so pro-choice. Please don't take that as I'm not. I'm just saying that these things do traumatize us in
Mhm.
ways that we don't necessarily realize in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. So Ruth also wasn't really helping her case either. She pretty much undermined her whole defense. She was dismissive, she was evasive, and when she was talking about her abusive and violent relationship, she was emotionless. It was like she was playing a part. It was like she had basically just resigned herself to the fact that she was gonna be convicted
I
and
just think
hung.
she sounds like a really traumatized woman, though.
They, yeah, it's
And
true, but
sometimes you do need to shut down to not feel it so much.
oh yeah, for sure. And if she was trying to protect Desmond, she probably thought that she was just being she just knew that she was going to be going down for murder, so why implicate anyone else?
Yeah.
But they asked about the miscarriage, and she said that she couldn't be sure that it was because of David, but he had thumped her in the belly, and that
Oh, don't.
but that he did only ever hit her with his hands. So
That's okay then, obviously.
yeah,
No?
I know.
How big's your thumb? And your, no?
But she was saying these things as if it made it was fine, if it made sense. It was just the strangest thing, they said. It was the strangest thing to listen to her talking about this. And when Christmas Humphreys asked what her intentions were when she left the house, she said, quite famously, you'll see this quote a lot when you're reading about Ruth Ellis. She said, "It's obvious when I shot him, intended to kill him." So,
Duh. Christmas.
duh. What else am I going to do? Christmas. Christmas Humphreys. So, by mid-morning,
He had to have the most serious job in the world because his name is so unserious.
so true.
He couldn't
So
have been a clown.
the trial started on the 20th of June in 1955 in the morning, and by 11:52 a.m. on the 21st of June,
Sorry, a
the
day.
yeah,
Day and a half.
a day and a half.
For murder.
Yeah.
Oh.
That was the when the jury retired. It was already finished. Yep. So the next day, and even more shocking, how many minutes of deliberation? I said minutes of deliberation.
17.
14.
Wow.
And they delivered their verdict of guilty. Guilty of murder. Yes, Catherine.
They don't decide on the death penalty though, do they?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they would probably I don't actually know.
No,
Perhaps
it's
they
the judge
did.
that hands down the sentence.
Yeah. Mm. But anyway, the aftermath of the sentencing was chaotic. So they received hundreds and hundreds of letters. Some people were sending in letters to say that she was a whore, that she was a reptile, and that if she didn't hang,
Reptile?
yeah, I know, like
Oh,
reptiles.
cold-blooded.
Mm, true.
Oh, see?
It
I was
makes
not so
sense.
stupid.
And then if she didn't hang, that households across Britain would shake. And if she wasn't published, then women would think they could get away with killing their husbands. Well, yeah, you're darn right. They should get away with
What,
killing
like
their
men
husbands.
think they can get away with rape because
Yeah.
nothing happens to them?
Interesting.
Interesting. Households would shake. They're so dramatic.
I know, right? But there were also hundreds of letters in support of Ruth as well, and those that were against the death penalty. They pleaded for her as a single mother, for her children, and for her mental state at the time. However, on the 11th of July, Lloyd George... Can't remember
David
who was
Lloyd
it.
George, the Prime Minister of the country. Go on, sorry.
He said that his decision is final. There were no special considerations, it was premeditated, and it was carried out with deliberation, and that her sex should not be grounds for preferential treatment, and that she had not shown any remorse.
What year was this?
1955.
But he can't have been Prime Minister for that long.
He wasn't. It wasn't him. Lloyd George, I think, was the...
I genuinely thought you were talking about him.
No.
Is he the... David Lloyd George, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but that's not...
He died in 1945, so it could
Right,
not
this
have been
was
him.
Gwilym Lloyd George, and he was the Conservative Home Secretary.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. Maybe
I genuinely just thought you were making a joke.
No, I thought it was David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. All right, I take it back.
Yeah? Okay, thanks. Okay, so... If a reprieve
oh
is
my god,
granted...
they were related. They
no,
were father and son.
Stop! I literally don't give a fuck. I have to leave soon.
They were
Stop.
father and
okay,
son.
Brilliant. I love that. Yay, fun. So if a reprieve is granted, then we would have to consider whether there is a place for capital punishment in the current law, which is what he said. He was a Conservative at the time, and the Tories were very pro-death penalty, so obviously he also had to uphold that. So if they couldn't apply the death penalty to someone that openly said that she intended to kill her lover, then who could be killed with the death penalty, you know?
Mm.
So on the 11th of July, once she had heard that her reprieve had been denied, she fired John Bickford, and Ruth hired someone called Victor Mishcon. Turns out that John Bickford might have also known Desmond Cusson, so maybe perhaps that was why she had also fired him. Fun fact, do you recognise the name Victor Mishcon?
No.
He was Princess Diana's divorce lawyer.
Oh.
But anyway, Victor convinced Ruth to tell her whole story, to tell the truth. She didn't want to do it because she said, it doesn't matter, I'm still going to die, I'm still going to hang. And he basically said, do it for your son, so your son knows the truth. And so she told the story about how she had actually spent the whole day drinking with Desmond. He gave her the loaded gun. He was jealous of David, and they actually hated each other, David and Desmond. And she was in a dazed state. She can't remember what was said, but she asked him to drive her to Hampstead, and he did. And that contradicted everything that Ruth had originally told the police. She said that she had taken a gun by herself, got in a taxi and gone there. But there wasn't anything about Desmond. She'd said that she'd seen Desmond the day before or something like that, that he was never there. He was never part of the story. But Ruth didn't want to fight for her defence, and she said that she was ready to die. Turns out that 17 years after Ruth's conviction, I can't work out what year that was, but Bickford also had to write to say his conscience was bothering him to the Commissioner of Police, that he had visited Desmond 3 days after the murder before. So he had asked for a statement from the prosecution, and they had denied him for some reason. I can't remember what the problem was. But Desmond had confessed to Bickford to say that he had provided the revolver, he had oiled it and cleaned it. The day before, had driven Ruth to Buckinghamshire looking for David Blakely, but they couldn't find him, so they drove back, and on their way back, they stopped at the woods, and Ruth had fired the gun at a tree to practice it, and then, driving back to London, Desmond had discarded the extra bullets and the cleaning supplies into the Thames. And he'd never said any of this to the police, only ever to Bickford, and Bickford hadn't made it public knowledge to anyone because he hates women. No, that was Stevenson that hates women.
Oh,
and
so what? That makes no sense. Bickford was the guy who wanted her to have all of the defence.
Yeah, exactly. But I think because legally he also wasn't allowed, he was denied the the chance to interview him. So I think that this was all technically off the record. But there was lots of conspiracy theories about whether they knew each other, whether Desmond was protected by people in the court.
But also, is it not confidential because he's not about to commit a crime, and it would be implicating Desmond, so he
Yeah.
doesn't have to come forward with it,
Yeah.
even if it's for the good of her defence.
Yeah.
If Desmond wants to keep it anonymous or private, he can, because
Yeah.
maybe, yeah.
I don't. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff around Desmond's part in this case, but he.
But if he's never been formally charged, I think with a lawyer it can stay confidential.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree. But it obviously wasn't confidential when he sent a letter to the Commissioner of Police writing all of this. But anyway, or before Ruth's death, people behind the scenes were fighting for her life up until the last minute. 90% of those sentenced to death in the 20th century were reprieved. So no one actually expected her to hang. In May 1955, so this was the same year that all of this was going on with Ruth, a 40-year-old woman named Sarah Lloyd, not related to any of the other Lloyds that we've spoken about, who had murdered her 87-year-old neighbour by hitting her with a spade and pouring boiling water over her, was sentenced to death in May 1955, like I said, which was just a month before Ruth was sentenced.
Cool, yeah.
But she received her reprieve on July 5th in 1955, just a few days before Ruth's scheduled execution. And they had,
Did they
and
say
there
what
hadn't,
grounds that's on?
there hadn't even been a petition to save her. It was, I think it was Sarah Lloyd's like husband or something like that had sent a letter, and they'd been like, yeah, okay, sure. Like there wasn't even a petition, and she had killed her 87-year-old elderly neighbour in cold blood, and she got a reprieve. So
I think it will have been a political move.
I think so too, and the fact that it was so everyone was talking about it, that it was almost like they were stubborn and they had to go through with it. But pretty much everyone was expecting the same to happen for Ruth Ellis. They was expecting there to be a reprieve. And the day before her scheduled death on 13th of July, well, the day before would be the 12th of July, crowds formed around the prison and they were all chanting her name. But at 9 a.m. on the 13th of July in 1955, Ruth was walked to the gallows and hung for the murder of David Blakely. So, the aftermath. How do you feel about this so far?
I think it's a political
in as
move.
few words as possible, because I've not got that much time left.
I think it was a political move to execute her. I think they thought, if she's working class, he's upper class, she's gone there, she's killed him. She never pressed charges for the domestic, and I'm not judging this, but she never pressed charges for the domestic violence. Is it going to become a regular thing that women just go, yes, he beat me, and therefore get away with it?
Yeah.
And so they had to set the precedence of, we've made our decision, we're not going to back down because a load of people write letters.
Yeah.
And actually it will have been the working class fighting for her, and the upper class fighting against her.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. And the thing is that if that Sarah Lloyd, who had killed her neighbour, had actually killed her husband, I'm sure perhaps that she wouldn't have been in the same boat, and she would have...
they don't care about an 87-year-old woman.
Yeah, maybe she wouldn't have been given a reprieve because it would have been her husband that had been dead. So the aftermath, Duncan Webb, he was an investigative journalist, he looked more deeply into Ruth Ellis's case, and he gathered all of the evidence that wasn't spoken about in the trial. For some reason I didn't write down when this happened, but he eventually spoke to Andre. He got his statement of events on the day of the murder, and he took note of Ruth's story of how Desmond helped, provided the gun, cleaned the gun, taught how to shoot the gun, and drove her to the crime scene. And they kept her family did try, and although she'd obviously died, they tried to get the courts to say that she was, in fact, she shouldn't have been hung, to at least say, that wasn't deserved.
Like when they pass it off posthumously?
Yeah, something like that. But they didn't allow that. But despite all of this, nothing changed. However, that's not to say that it wasn't a catalyst for bigger change. Many say that Ruth's death was a paving stone to finally abolish the death sentence in Britain. In the wake of Ruth's execution, the publisher Victor Gollancz and writer Arthur Koestler launched the national campaign for the abolition of capital punishment, and just 2 years after Ruth's conviction, the argument for a diminished responsibility was introduced to the British legal system via the Homicide Act, which meant that someone could have a lesser sentence for manslaughter if they reached a tipping point that caused them to commit murder, or if their mental state affected their actions, thus limiting capital punishments to certain types of murder. So if that had been in place when Ruth was in court, she probably would have been sentenced to manslaughter rather than murder. In 1964, on the 13th of August, Peter Allen and Gwyn Evans were the last men hanged in the last judicial execution to take place in Britain. In 1965, the Murder Act, also known as the Abolition of Death Penalty, ends capital punishment for murder, initially for 5 years, but it's made permanent in 1969. In 1971, Ruth's body was exhumed from Holloway Prison, where she had been buried, and laid to rest in Buckinghamshire, just 3 miles from David Blakely's grave, which is where she wanted to be. And her son's ashes were buried. She loved him. She even wrote a letter to his mum saying that she will continue to love him, and that I hope she finds peace, knowing that she has been, she's received, what's the word? She has been found guilty and killed for her crimes. And Andre's ashes were also buried at his mum's graveside. Thomas L. Jones wrote, "The misfortune of Ruth Ellis was not just that she killed a man, nor was it that his death resulted in her being hanged, the last woman ever by the British judicial system. The real tragedy of Ruth Ellis was that she died for the love of a man who did not deserve it." And that's my story.
That was a great story. I feel sorry for her kid.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Why are men such assholes?
Tell me about it. Her daughter also, she died of cancer.
Georgina. We didn't hear much about her.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't really. She went and lived with her dad, and she. I mean, I think she was adopted after that. But I think she died when she was about 50 of cancer, of natural causes. So, thankfully, I think that she was a little bit more protected from everything. So, it didn't have as much of a negative impact on her. But yeah, it's a crazy, crazy story. It's interesting because, like I said at the start, you knew that she was guilty of murder, but it's interesting to see so many other factors that come into play and how that makes us think about the sentencing that she should have received and the punishment, the appropriate punishment.
Yeah, I think it's not always as clear cut. I think if murder results in the death penalty, then she should have got the death penalty. If it's that clear cut. However, because it's not always that murder resulted in the death penalty, that's where there's a grey area. And I also think
Go on.
I also think that she shouldn't have got murder. I don't think it should be first degree murder.
And the thing is what irks me is that 90% of death penalties received reprieves in that era. So it's just like, what was the point of the death penalty if you were always going to give a reprieve to 90% of them anyway? And why not her? Yeah. So
I think it was a class thing. I think it was a political move.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. But yeah, no, it's just there was just a lot more that should have been considered, and not a lot of it was said in court and was thought about during her trial. So,
well, the person I'm going to tell you about tomorrow or Friday? Tomorrow. Sadly, still alive, but 100% deserves the death penalty.
Oh, I'm ready.
Yeah, if we want to bring it back to them.
Yeah.
Off with the head.
Off with their head. Okay, I've got to run because I've got to go walk a doggo.
I know. Have you calmed down now?
No, because I literally have to run. So I'm leaving. I love you. Follow us on everything, and we'll
maybe when you go, I'll sing a song to like sort of wind down because I feel like you were very antsy and we need to just
Okay.
calm you down. What calms you down as much as me telling you to calm down?
What calms me as much as you telling me to calm down? Literally nothing at all. I'm leaving, and I love you, and bye.